This week, I watched Netflix documentary 13th on the racial injustice of the American prison system. As I reflected on it, and I highly recommend watching it by the way, I was thinking about whether there might be a religious aspect to the thought process behind American ideas on incarceration. It's why I think that even religion done right is harmful. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. I have a new patron to announce. Lars Persson has joined as a grandbaby. Welcome to the family, Lars. I also want to say a special thank you to Ricardo Oliveira, who helped me with research on this project. It was a bit difficult as it is somewhat obscure. As I reflected on the documentary 13th, one aspect that I focused on is why, in America, do we think when people commit a crime, they should be punished for life? We have the death penalty. We have more life sentences, especially sentences of life without the possibility of parole in this country than is the case in most other countries. Another aspect that is very difficult is that, unlike other countries, here, people who pay their debt to society can never escape their prison record. They lose the right to vote. Some can get it back, but many cannot. Ex-convicts have a hard time finding employment because they have to reveal their criminal record in their employment application. It's not like this in other countries. Why is this the case here? The biggest reason that a criminal record follows a convict seeking employment is that we live in a litigious society. If an employer hires someone who was previously convicted of assault to work with customers, and the employee assaults a customer, the employer is liable for the assault. Because the employee did this before, the employer knew or should have known that this could happen again. But if the employer vets his employees and sees that they have no criminal record, they've never been charged with a crime, and then that employee assaults a customer, the employer is not at fault. It was considered unforeseeable. But in the UK and France, for example, an employer is liable for all acts of an employee acting within the scope of his employment. In other words, the employee is acting in furtherance of the employer's business and not for personal reasons. There is no exception for employers that had no reason to know that the employee would do this. The employer is liable for any criminal acts in furtherance of his business, not just foreseeable acts. Germany, like the U.S., takes causation into consideration also in making an exception when the employer has taken the precaution of checking the background of the employee. To overcome bias against hiring people convicted of criminal offenses, Roger James, an attorney in the London office of Ogletree Deakins, says many countries, including Australia, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, observe the concept of spent convictions. If an offense is minor and the person has served his or her sentence, the conviction is considered spent, and employers can't inquire about it. This concept protects employees and potential recruits from having to disclose old convictions to obtain most types of work. It is aimed at maximizing the potential of former prisoners to lead a law-abiding life and contribute positively to society, something which is much less likely if they are unemployed, James said. According to research by the Indiana Department of Correction, unemployment was the greatest predictor of recidivism, and unemployed offenders were more than twice as likely to reoffend as those who had a job. Businesses can help reduce recidivism by giving the formerly incarcerated a second chance. In the United States, almost a third of the working-age adults have criminal records. According to Johnny Taylor, president of the Society for Human Resource Management, many prisoners and ex-offenders are desperate to make an honest living and would make hard-working, loyal employees. All they need is a second chance. Companies must no longer view a criminal record as an automatic disqualification for employment. But because employers are saddled with the additional liability for hiring ex-convicts, this isn't possible. Even an employer who wants to give a hand to former offenders, doing so can affect the employer's ability to obtain affordable or even any employer's liability insurance. So the economic structure of our country perpetuates the problem. The only possible way to change this is through legislation, making it illegal to ask about past offenses and changing laws with regards to employers' liability. But why? Why is it this way? Why did we set the rules to be so harsh? Why is punishment for a crime a permanent stain even after the offender has paid their debt to society? In finance, once someone pays off a debt to a lender, the lender has no power over the former debtor. But in the United States, after an offender pays their debt to society, society holds a permanent grudge, never forgiving the debt that has already been paid. Why, in the criminal arena, do we view a paid debt so differently than we do in the financial arena? I think the answer is religion. I think the Christian upbringing of the majority of Americans leads to this way of thinking. The Christian religion teaches that after death you go to God for judgment and there is no second chance. You have to believe while you are on earth to be found righteous in the afterlife. And failing to have believed before death results in damnation for eternity. There is no second chance. Once you are found guilty, you are guilty for eternity. Further, it doesn't matter what your crime is. If the only thing you ever did wrong in your entire life was to tell a single lie, you are guilty of everything, even murder, according to James 2:10. And even though everything you did in this lifetime was temporary, it's over and done with, your punishment is eternal. I struggled with this idea as a Christian, and a pastor explained to me that it is because God is eternal and your sin is ever before God. Psalm 51:3. If your sin is ever before you, it's ever before God also. Then verse 4 says that because of this, God is justified in punishing whatever you do. And if he says the punishment is eternal, then that is just. Psalm 51 used to be my favorite psalm. I memorized it, but now I find it disgusting. The intent is to make the Christian contrite and humble for their shortcomings, but they are left with the idea that eternal punishment is just. Harsh punishment for minor offenses is common in the Bible, like the death penalty for working on the Sabbath and for children being uncontrollable. I think this is why many Americans push for harsher punishments, longer prison sentences, more death sentences, and more restrictions on ex-convicts. Because once you have offended, your offense is ever before you. This, I think, is why the religiosity of America has led us to where we are. This is why I think that even religion done right, and by that I mean no sex abuse, no hate preaching, no scams of prayer in exchange for money, and so on, still leads to a seriously damaged society. Just look at the current state of the United States with regards to this. We have the highest incarceration rate. 2.3 million Americans are now in jail. That's almost 10% of the U.S. adult population. The majority of those have never been convicted of the crimes they are accused of, and many have never been convicted of any crime. Their only crime is not being able to afford bail. So I started looking into whether there is a link between religion and ideas on criminal justice, or am I just finding a pattern in two separate but unrelated things? I was not surprised to find that there was not a lot out there to be found, but I didn't come away empty-handed either. I do have to apologize that most of these sources that I've cited, I could not get full access to the articles. They wanted $8 to $45 a piece for access to the full articles. And while I realize that conducting research is expensive and scholars deserve compensation for using their work, this video would have cost me $132 to make just to get access to all the articles that are referenced in the description that I used. Not to mention that the links that I provide for the articles would only get my viewers a preview. So while I'm only giving you a small sample of the work that is out there, and by that I mean I'm only using the previews of the articles rather than the full articles, I think for our purposes, this small sample is sufficient. Religion and social control have been a sociological concern, and the relationship between religion and punishment has long been the subject of speculation. However, surprisingly little empirical research exists on the role of religion or religious context in criminal justice, and almost no research on the role of religious context on actual sentencing practices, according to Thomas O'Connor at the Center for Social Research. Existing research finds relationships between biblical literalism and punishment in general, says Ulmer, Bader, and Galt in a joint research paper that focused on sentencing in Pennsylvania. We find that county Christian religious homogeneity increases the likelihood of incarceration. In addition, Christian homogeneity, as well as the prevalence of civically engaged denominations, conditions the effects of important legally relevant detriments of incarceration. Furthermore, we find evidence that Christian homogeneity activates the effect of local Republican electoral dominance on incarceration. We argue that Christian homogeneity affects sentencing practices primarily through local political processes that shape the election of judges and prosecutors. Scholarly and popular writings typically describe conservative Protestants as having punitive criminal justice preferences. See reviews by Applegate 2000 and Univer 2005. In Gregg v. Georgia in 1976, the United States Supreme Court declared that public opinion, including the public's presumed desire for retribution, can be a legitimate basis for penal policy. Subsequently, the retributive doctrine has guided sentencing reform across the nation. But variation among the public in support for retribution as the goal of punishment and the effects of religion in shaping public sentiments about punishment have received little attention from researchers. Drawing from recent work on attribution theory and religion, this paper proposes and reports evidence that public support for retributive doctrine is closely linked to affiliation with fundamentalist Protestant denominations and fundamentalist religious beliefs. The normative implications of such a connection are addressed. Baptist and fundamentalist judges also sentenced more punitively, but they were not more likely than other judges to discriminate against black or disadvantaged offenders. Local judges appeared to be more responsive to public demands for incarceration and sentenced more particularistically. The bias against ex-offenders in this country is entrenched in our society. It is enforced not just by judges and prosecutors, but by employers and insurance companies that have a financial interest in avoiding liability. It's enforced by the general populace that demands law and order, demands that judges be harsh with offenders or they can't get elected. In the Netflix documentary that I discussed, 13th, they talk about how since the Reagan era and the war on drugs, no Democrat can get elected unless they also embrace a stance that isn't perceived as soft on crime. Thus, even Bill Clinton ran on a platform of being tough on criminals. Under President Obama, the explosive increase in prison population continued. No progressive can get legislation through on this issue until we reach the grassroots, the attitudes of the general population. I think that needs to be done through compassion for people. Sam Harris, in The Moral Landscape, points out that people have a hard time relating to statistics about large groups of people. We have empathy when we focus on individuals, where we can see them and hear their stories. Within our own community of YouTube atheists, we have Grumpy Old Dude.
I am the grumpy old dude.
A man doing great work exposing the ideology of white supremacists as an ex-con and a former white supremacist. He has experienced exactly what I'm talking about. He has difficulty finding employment because of his past. Despite having paid his debt to society, society is still not ready to forgive him. I forgive you, grumpy old dude. But while I was still a believer, I don't think that I would have. Which is why I think that even religion done right is damaging. It's unforgiving, harsh, and seeks retribution instead of rehabilitation. Thus, I think the first step to reform is to reject Christianity and live your life.